There's an old joke you might have heard. It goes something like this. How do you get 100 Canadians out of a pool? Okay, everyone, it's time to get out of the pool. The stereotype is that Canadians are super polite. So, how did Canada turn into this?
We've had more synagogues targeted in Canada with gunfire, arson, vandalism than any other country in the world, as far as I can tell. Jews are being attacked on the streets in Canada.
Today, I'm joined by Jesse Brown, founder of Canadaland, an independent news company. He recently explored what's driving a massive rise of antisemitism and violence in the country. Based on the best available data, there are more attacks on Jews per capita in Canada than anywhere else in the West. You might be shocked by this because big mainstream media aren't telling you about it. But people who track these things have called Montreal the anti-Semitism capital of North America. That is sound from a so-called pro-Palestinian protest in Montreal this week, in which figures were hanged in effigy. They've got these nooses around their necks, including President Trump, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, and a figure of a man wearing a kippah, a Jewish ritual head covering. Apparently, that man is supposed to represent Itamar Ben-Gvir, a very controversial Israeli minister, but the head is facing down. So all you can see is the kippah. And that image is circulating around the world, getting support from anti-Semites. Meanwhile, in an earlier episode, I played you sound of a woman at a protest in Montreal praising Hitler and calling for the final solution against Jews. This stuff keeps happening. I spoke with Jesse about the media in Canada, its role in the growing vicious hatred, and how it differs from media in the United States.
In Canada, the worse the media has done here, the more government support they've gotten.
That's coming up. Plus, the BBC is under fire for its sexist, warped reporting from Afghanistan. Looking at little girls being sold into sex slavery, the BBC called it a story of Afghan fathers being forced to make impossible choices. To the BBC, that's the story. They're poor fathers. It's also wrong. They're not being forced. That and more coming up today on They Stand Corrected. Hello and welcome. So great to have you here. My name is Josh Libbs, and this is the podcast that shows the media that they stand corrected. You can learn about me in the show notes or at my website, joshlibs.com. I spent 20 years in big mainstream media, 10 on NPR, 10 on CNN. And while I was fact-checking politicians and pundits, I saw how badly the media itself needs to be corrected. No one else was doing that. So now this show is. And along with it comes a newsletter, which is filled with links, proof, videos, all kinds of stuff. Unlike the media, I don't expect you to take my word for anything. I want you to be able to see all this stuff for yourself if you're interested. It's free. It's on a platform or website called Substack. You'll find that link in the show notes too. And the best way to support this show is to become a paid subscriber to the newsletter. Those folks get a lot of extra content that you don't get anywhere else. Fact checks of the media. I answer questions directly. Paid subscribers do the most to determine what this show focuses on week after week. And I always try to thank one of the latest paid subscribers. Let's see. Joseph wrote, I haven't seen this yet. Josh, you're the foil to misinformation and disinformation in the media. No one else is earnestly fact-checking the media. Most media consumers have no idea how their opinions about the world are shaped by false information. We need you. Among the smart people I follow, only you make me literally and regularly facepalm. I like that. Thank you so much to him and to everyone who is supporting the show. There are other ways to do so. We'll talk about that later, but let's jump into this. First for you today, this madness from the BBC.
I'm ready to sell my daughters. I'm poor and in debt.
The BBC headlined this story, Selling Children to Survive, Afghan Fathers Forced to Make Impossible Choices. To the BBC, which is just filled with radicalized people, that is the story, that these men, these fathers, allegedly have no choice but to sell their little daughters into slavery. Everything is wrong with this. Here's a bit more from that report.
Shaika needed surgery for appendicitis. Her father, Saeed Ahmad, had no money, and so he agreed to sell his daughter for 200,000 Afghani, just over $3,000. In 5 years, when she's 10, Shaika will leave her family to go to the home of the distant relative who's bought her to marry his son.
On social media, some women called this out. Sonia Sodha, columnist in the UK, wrote, "Why doesn't this BBC story examine why there's a market for fathers selling their young daughters to other men in the first place?" It's like the reality that these girls are being sold as child brides to be raped by adult men is invisible. She's right. And the idea that there's no choice about this doesn't even make sense. In every society, always, people only have as much freedom as they demand from their own government. If men have a problem with this in Afghanistan, which they should rise up and demand that this practice be stopped. This report says these families are not getting any help from the government. No surprise there, the Taliban controls it, and the Taliban is as backward and violent and sexist as humans get. And these families say they've gotten no help from NGOs, non-governmental organizations. No surprise there either. There are some good people who work for NGOs who go into that line of work for the right reasons. But the NGO system is so poisoned by activists who have gone in there just to push their personal agendas. That's a media issue too, because major news organizations have given up on reporting from large parts of the world. And instead, they just say, here's what this NGO says, like Amnesty or Human Rights Watch. These places get things wrong all the time. They are extremely biased. And it's no surprise when people say they're not getting any actual help from NGOs. But back to this report. The BBC portrays these men as being in a situation in which there's no other choice. Why does the BBC see it that way? The answer is simple. Victim narratives. Of course, it doesn't occur to the BBC that these are adult human beings with the agency to get together, stand up, and demand better conditions from their government. And yes, that would mean facing a brutal crackdown, probably, but that's what you risk, even your life, if it means getting your daughters out of sex slavery. It's up to Afghans to demand that this practice end. Also, some people online have pointed out that this practice of selling girls as brides has been the case in Afghanistan for centuries. I did an episode recently on the at least 50 million people in modern slavery. When you combine the figures for sex trafficking and forced marriage, more than half of that total can be considered sex slavery. I also talked about the girls and boys sold into marriage at early ages as part of that. 640 million women and girls alive today were married off as children. So were 115 million boys and men, based on the best statistics available. The nations with the highest rates of child brides include Niger, Central African Republic, Chad, Mali, and Bangladesh. It's a horrific practice. Instead of asking news audiences to pity the people who are keeping it going, maybe expect them to fight with everything they've got to make it stop. But in the minds of people who control big media, people who live in Islamist societies, societies that force Islamism onto the population through the government, these folks can only be portrayed as victims. Speaking of victim narratives, my guest today explains what happened when the highest levels of Canada's government took on that mentality. It became institutionalized in the Canadian media. And that speaks to some unique problems that Canada has. Things work a bit differently there. Here's how this came about. I heard from a guy who works with Jesse Brown, the founder of Canadaland. He told me Jesse would be such a great guest for this show. I love when people pitch me guests, by the way, so keep it coming. And he was right. Jesse is a Canadian journalist who tells stories about Canada, and he has a sharp eye on Canadian media. He recently did a series called What is Happening Here?, in which he delved into reasons for a massive explosion of anti-Semitism in the country. We're going to get to that in our conversation. Going into it, let me give you the big picture. Based on the most extensive statistics available, Canada has the highest levels of attacks against Jews per capita of any country in the West. B'nai B'rith Canada, last year alone, recorded close to 7,000 incidents. The numbers have been skyrocketing since the October 2023 massacres. Attacks last year included the stabbing of a Jewish woman in her 70s in the kosher section of a grocery store, a Hasidic 32-year-old man beaten in Montreal in front of his children in an assault that was circulated online. This stuff keeps happening. You'll hear more examples coming up. In raw numbers, there are more violent assaults on Jews in America, but per capita, it's even worse in Canada, where the population is much smaller. I asked Jesse about whether the media has been overtaken by the same propaganda mentality as our media here and become fundamentally anti-Semitic.
Short answer is yes. All but totally captured. The media has failed so completely on covering these issues. Just your basic duty to inform people about what's going on and giving them the names and understanding it. There's all of this internal culture of withholding information from the public. So there's sort of like the institutional level in which they failed. Like it's endemic. The culture of Canadian journalism is totally captured by kind of like a group think about who's good and who's bad on this issue. There are some exceptions. The National Post is the kind of conservative paper, and to their credit, they've been covering the wave of anti-Semitism in Canada.
Yeah, and these things shouldn't be left versus right anyway. If you just follow the basic rules of journalism, you would have understandable, legitimate coverage. I want to go back a second. You said that there's this culture of withholding information that's unique to Canada. What's that about?
Well, it shows itself at different places. One aspect of it is not publishing the names of people charged with hate crimes. There's been a long-running debate in Canadian newsrooms about not wanting to heap scorn upon certain communities. So this is all kind of like aftermath of 9/11 stuff. Now, it is true that Muslims had a really hard time in Canada as they did elsewhere after 9/11. However, that doesn't leave you in a very good position when you do have people harming Jews throughout Canada in the name of Islam or Islamism or a religious-based anti-Zionism. And so article after article where it's like pulling teeth to even know what's happening. Like a school bus was torched. What school bus? For what school? Oh, it was a school bus that's rented by a school. Well, what school? A Jewish school. Oh, that wasn't in the headline. And when the police release the name of the person charged, which the police don't always do, often the media won't include the name if it's an Arab name.
Wait, hold on. They specifically choose not to if it's an Arab name. But if it's not an Arab name, then they're more likely to share the name in the media?
More likely is the way to put it, because you're not going to see the policy document if it exists. These decisions are made on a case-by-case basis. But I've been in newsrooms where we have conversations about, like, should we publish the name? And, my point of view is like, look, I understand the concern here, but our job is to inform people.
You just say what the fact is. Yeah. Who are the people making these decisions inside these newsrooms? Are they people who are from those communities, or are they just people who are so far caught up in leftist ideology that they think it's okay to have separate sets of rules based on perceptions of victimhood against groups?
If you're imagining people who are like doctrinaire, progressive, spouting kind of like academic theory, that's not really what you're going to encounter in most newsrooms. What you're seeing instead is the way in which that kind of thinking kind of becomes bureaucratized and trickles down in a country where it was embraced by the prime minister. So, what people dismiss as woke politics or, everything to do from DEI to anti-racism has kind of been formed into policy in a lot of newsrooms. It's sort of how anti-racist thinking and a desire not to discriminate becomes its own form of discrimination. But Josh, it goes beyond that. Like the anchor of the CTV national news, this is the most popular television news broadcast in Canada, this guy Omar Sachedina, in the early days after October 7th, the first major rally of Jews in Canada after months of anti-Semitic violence. On the nightly news broadcast, that rally was described as a pro-war rally. And if you're wondering who could possibly support this terrible genocidal war, here they are. And lo and behold, 2 teenagers were arrested. They were in possession of explosives. They were going to murder as many Jews as they could. And the nightly news said, yeah, this is the pro-war rally. And they haven't retracted that.
Okay, I'm jumping in here to give you some more details on that. It wasn't just a couple of youngsters learning how to make bombs on the internet or whatever. Here is a clip from the Canadian outlet Global News.
The plot was in its advanced stages when the RCMP counterterrorism unit made their arrests. Court documents obtained by Global News confirm one of the boys was in possession of TATP, a homemade explosive, as well as ball bearings. TATP has been used in major ISIS terror attacks around the globe.
And we don't know who these 2 young people are because in Canada, the media is barred from releasing the names of minors who commit crimes. That law may have good intentions, but it prevents people from finding out that certain communities of young people are being disproportionately targeted for radicalization. It prevents the media and the public from looking into how these kids are being radicalized. Back to Jesse.
The only reason why I know why at least one of them is Muslim is because the kid's father was quoted talking about the kid's online radicalization, and the father was Muslim. Otherwise, I'd hear people saying, how do we know they weren't Jews? Which is what I get all the time. In the absence of the names, you get lies, right? And conjecture and conspiracy theory.
The media is actively miseducating the public in Canada about what's going on, making things more dangerous. We have that here too with the miseducation. In addition to the role of the media, what are the biggest factors that are making Canada so especially anti-Semitic at this time?
There's 2 main factors that I kind of arrive at. One is a big difference between America and Canada on an ideological basis, where in the States, at least, there is tension between this growing movement of grievance that is not limited to anti-Israelism, anti-Zionism, whatever you want to call it, but it is this, movement and culture of grievance against American imperialism. Everything is sort of getting turned into one big omni-cause. But in America, there's a tension between that and another voice. And you elected a president who's kind of one of the defining characteristics is opposition to woke, right? So in Canada, there is no resistance. The politics of oppressor versus oppressed, the politics of anti-racism are the national narrative. Justin Trudeau said that we are a post-national country, like we sort of have no national identity. And what you get is nothing constraining. Like what Americans can see in Canada is like, this is what happens when nobody is pushing back against this anti-Zionist and et cetera thing. It gets bolder, it gets infused into organizations, it becomes a witch hunt against everyday people. If you hate Israel, it makes sense to protest an American politician that supports Israel. If you hate Israel in Canada, like all of our politicians are kind of with you. It makes no sense to protest our politicians, but you got to protest someone if you're filled with rage, if your identity has become this anti-Israel thing. So invariably it moves on to just everyday Jewish people. And the second part of it is, and this is uncomfortable for me as somebody who, like, what I'm proud of about Canada is that we are a country that up until October 7th, I would have argued, has like nailed it when it comes to being a safe refuge for immigrants around the world, where people integrate very peacefully. I would have been one to have repeated that sort of Canadian identity, that we are not just polite and nice, but we are inclusive in a real way. And we're inclusive in a way that we don't demand that you assimilate. Enter into that Muslim immigration on a massive scale, where we have tripled the Muslim population in about 20 years. And so now you've got 1.2% of Canada is Jewish, 5% is Muslim. Trudeau famously allowed mass immigration from Syria. So there's also been an incredible amount of immigration from Pakistan. I've been in favor. We got a lot of land here in Canada. Immigration has only benefited Canada in the long run. But when you put those things together, Josh, just as a point of objective truth, they're coming from countries in which Jew hate is taught. You're raised on Jew hate.
Oh, it's fundamental. Yep.
It just is. And then you come to a country where nobody is saying to you, welcome to Canada. We're happy to have you here, but we do things a bit differently here. And there's certain things that are not going to be okay here. And here's what you need to know if you want to thrive here.
Jesse says, as bad as it may be for the U.S. to have partisan media attacking each other, not having that might make conditions in Canada even worse. That's coming up. Plus, why the Canadian media is getting record amounts of taxpayer support despite shrinking audiences. Oh, Canada. NPR recently received $113 million from two extremely wealthy donors. And the network followed up by asking you to give money. NPR has been publishing social media posts saying, hey, we need you to give money to make all this work possible, right after those big donations were announced. They don't need your money. Since I left big media after my years both in NPR and CNN, I've seen so clearly that in this era, telling the truth, fact-checking, means getting away from big legacy bureaucratic media. Those places are poisoned. They're trading on the names they once had, but they're not pulling through for you. Not anymore. The media owes you the truth, which means facts plus context. It's not giving you both. But this show does, and this show runs on your support. No bazillionaires are funding this. You can support this show in different ways. You can use the Buy Me a Coffee link. There's also a PayPal link, or become a paid subscriber to the newsletter. The additional content you get includes information on how to access virtually any major news outlet online for free, legally. News agencies operating with hundreds of millions or even billions of dollars don't need your hard-earned money. Show them that they stand corrected. Support this show and send a note to those other agencies saying why you're doing so. I have simple instructions in the newsletter. Or just visit my website, joshlebs.com. In the U.S., we have major media pushing big lies of the right and big lies of the left. But in Canada, Jesse Brown says things are different.
So what's happened in Canada is that we do not have, at the corporate media level, at the mainstream or legacy media level, a very healthy divide between left and right. It might be weird for people to hear healthy because it's anything but healthy if you're an American and you got two kinds of partisan media yelling at each other. But I got to tell you, that's a lot healthier than having media that all agree. If everybody agrees, that's what's really dangerous. So in Canada, we have one really dominant player, and that is the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, the CBC. It's public broadcasting. I used to work there. People are not wrong for equating it with sort of like the voice of Canada mainstream, especially during liberal governments. It feels like the mouthpiece of like what right-thinking people in Canada are supposed to be talking about and saying. And as the media industry dies, like it's in terrible shape in Canada, the CBC is getting more funding than ever. It's getting to a point where like just a very significant number of journalists who still have jobs in Canada work for the CBC. Into that vacuum, Josh, has rushed a new kind of digital media in Canada, which you're really familiar with, but Canada has been pioneering it along with American outlets. So, you know, we have hyper right-wing media like Rebel News and a good dozen other also-rans that are doing a tidy business representing disaffected Canadians and right-wing Canadians. So it's not Fox News versus CNN in Canada. It's this kind of basket of various independent outlets kind of bashing away at the CBC and the government.
Are they eating away at any of the audience? None of these places change unless they face real business consequences over it. That's why I'm always telling people, don't pay for failed media. But if the CBC is public, then it would have to take a giant chunk of their audience for CBC to even care, right?
You were spot on until you got to the part where they theoretically care. They have been bleeding audience. They're in the worst shape they've ever been, and they do not care because their funding only goes up. It went up under Trudeau, and now Carney has just made a cut. So it's technically just gone down a little bit, but I think it's still at like near record levels.
Even with fewer people watching and listening, their funding goes up. Why is it so incredibly high if it's not doing the job?
What you just described makes a lot of sense in an American. It was spoken like a true American. In Canada, the worse the media has done here, the more government support they've gotten. And it's gone beyond the CBC. Because the rebel newses of the world, the politicians hate them. I mean, even the conservative politicians hate them. So what's happened in Canada is all of the major papers, including the National Post and Post Media, which are conservative, they went to the government and they said, if you don't help us, we're going to be out of business. And now there are media subsidies for everyone in Canada, except for some of these upstarts.
Why are taxpayers allowing the leaders to keep tossing so incredibly much money at CBC when those same taxpayers, those same citizens are paying less attention to it? They just like the idea of it being there.
Elections in Canada are not fought over funding to the CBC. And if you ask people, do you listen to the CBC? Fewer of them are listening. If you watch the CBC, fewer of them are watching, and the ratings bear that out. If you ask them, do you trust the CBC? Fewer of them trust the CBC. But if you ask Canadians, do you want to get rid of the CBC or defund the CBC? We're not comfortable with that.
I just mean less funding, not necessarily defunding, but the idea that it's at record levels, that's what's wild.
Yeah. What Canadians are afraid of is just being awash in American media and not having any kind of representation. What Canadians want them to be doing is their jobs, which is covering Canadian news.
So it sounds like things are getting worse. The media is going to keep getting worse. And Canada's anti-Semitism and media failure are this runaway train that's ultimately going to crash and burn. There's no sign that anything is going to improve. Or do you see things that way?
You can't like wake up every morning and do media and be a pessimist. That being said, what I am most concerned about is that there is every reason to believe that something really bad is going to happen here. We've had like 7 mass killing plots thwarted, like Bondi Beach style massacres of Jews that were like serious ones where people were in contact with ISIS, in possession of weapons or explosives. How long before one of them gets through? We've had more synagogues targeted in Canada with gunfire, arson, vandalism than any other country in the world, as far as I can tell. Jews are being attacked on the streets in Canada. Pessimistically, something really bad would have to happen, I think, for it to be taken seriously.
Even then, though.
And even then, I wonder, and this is the most important thing in Canada, I think, not just because I'm a Jew. We've never seen a violent social movement in Canada, a violent political movement in Canada like this. And it's like being endorsed by powerful people. Nothing is really constraining it. The NDP, which is of the 3 main federal parties, it's the one furthest to the left. They just elected a new leader. If you watch the news footage, you don't see a Canadian flag behind the guy. There's a Palestinian flag. The prime minister has said that he'll arrest Netanyahu if Netanyahu sets foot on Canadian soil. But that does send a signal. You sense that if you're crusading against Zionists as you see them, which often just means your Jewish neighbor, the prime minister's like kind of on side. And so is the mayor. She called it a genocide here in Toronto. Like you kind of get a sense that this is all acceptable stuff and everyone's united. I hope it's not going to take something terrible. Usually it's when something happens elsewhere in the world. Canada reacts to things elsewhere in the world.
Yeah, but look what happened this time. October 7th was the worst. And it just led to more hatred, more anti-Semitism. We've had synagogue attacks here, and it's not slowing anything down. Things keep getting worse.
Yeah. I don't know. What do you think? Like, what would stop it?
I'm with you on the optimism, just in the sense that there's a reason to get up and fight every day. There's a reason to fight this. So I just think we all have to do our part. And for me, it's pointing out the only 2 things that the media responds to. Because when you say you're biased, when you talk about subjective things, they don't care. But there are 2 things they have to take responsibility for, which are facts and rules. So I'm always bringing it back to that. You got this fact wrong. It's not subjective, it's objective. And the rules. Here's how you handle this everywhere else. Here's how you handle it here. I'm also just hoping to help this effort to hold the media accountable grow into a movement that will get the media to listen. Sometimes I just think about the long-term future. At least as long as digital records exist, there will be a record. And I don't mean me personally, like legacy. I mean, the information, the fact-checking will be out there. And maybe someone somewhere someday will look back at this disastrous coverage and hear these fact checks and understand how society fell apart.
Yeah, I think about that a lot too. That you can sound very foolishly idealistic if you think that journalism matters and that like you publish something and the world changes. It doesn't really work that way. But if you don't have people creating a record, if there is no evidence of what the facts were as these things were happening, then the narrative is controlled by liars. So the long arc of truth, maybe, I don't know. I think about this. What do I want from non-Jewish people who listen to what I have to say? Like, I don't really, I'm not appealing for pity or sympathy. I want them to see that this is a threat to them as much as it is to me. If you've got people on the street who are openly advocating for political violence, it's going to catch up with you. And it already has in Canada. We've had shots fired at the American embassy. I'm surprised that didn't make national headlines. The same exact type of violence has now come at the Free Iran community here, the anti-regime community. Gunfire at some of their spaces, and the guy ran a car into some of these protesters. So, once you open the door for political violence, and I do feel like there is like a Canadian sense of just like, leave me the fuck alone. Like, let me live. I don't need this grief. I'm waiting for mainstream Canada, because I think it just purely is. Like, it ain't good to have this on the streets.
No, it ain't. What all this means for Americans of any background who have thought of Canada as a backup plan, coming up. As Americans get increasingly fed up with economic struggles, the cost of healthcare, and political craziness, they are looking elsewhere. Canada is always a backup plan in the minds of many. You may be surprised to learn that emigration to Canada has apparently gone down over the past year, according to what seem to be the best figures available. The Wall Street Journal reports that American citizens are leaving the United States in record numbers for a bunch of other countries. Canada is competing. It passed a law opening up citizenship to anyone with a direct ancestor. But as you've heard here today, Canada is no utopia. When anti-Semitic and political violence is allowed to flourish, no society thrives. All of us need to fight for a better society where we live. We fight by speaking out, calling out the haters and liars, demanding an end to the bigotry, just like those men I discussed at the top who have to fight instead of selling their daughters. People only get the safety, security, and freedom that they demand from their own governments. People need to know that all this is happening. They need truth. You can help by spreading the word, sharing this show, rating and reviewing it. That triggers the algorithms to recommend it to other people. Basically, you just go to the page for this show on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen and give it 5 stars. Apple lets you type out reviews. I read every one, and they make a big difference. Also, share this show with individuals you know who may be interested. Tell them why you think this will interest them specifically. This episode in particular, send it to everyone in Canada. Well, I'll tell you what, maybe half the Canadian population. So just over 20 million people. That sounds doable, right? I want to know what you think. There are 2 great ways to reach me. The best is through the newsletter, and the second is through a form at my website. You'll find links in the show notes. As always, thank you so much for listening, and I will see you next week.